Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Pentecost with APA Virginia staff. Thank you for joining us for our monthly webinar series, Your Hour with APA Virginia, sponsored by the Berkeley Group. Our webinars are the fourth Monday of each month from noon to 1 p.m., covering different topics in planning and related fields. Today, we have Michelle Diamond and Kevin Snyder from FEMA Region 3 in Philadelphia. They are presenting Building Community Capacity and Resilience Through Pre-Disaster Recovery Planning. They will take all questions at the end. Please type them in the questions box on the panel on the right. Please visit the webinar page on apavirginia.com for CM credit information. You can receive 1 credit for viewing this live. We'll post all webinars to the YouTube page within 24 hours. Please mark your calendars for next month's webinar on November 27th, Translating Planning Goals into Project Actions for Sustainable Communities. That's with Denise Nelson of the Berkeley Group. In other news, APA Virginia is pleased to announce the 2018 annual conference, Mountains of Influence, at Wintergreen Resort on July 22nd through the 25th, 2018. Visit apavirginia.com for information on call for proposals, award nominations, and sponsorship opportunities. All 3 of those things are currently open for the upcoming conference. I will now hand it over to Michelle and Kevin. Again, thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michelle Diamond. I wanted to thank you for spending your lunchtime with us, and I'm delighted to get the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about what we do here at FEMA with the National Disaster Recovery Framework and with our federal partners and how we support recovery with state and local governments. So some of the themes for today that I'd like to talk about are really the National Disaster Recovery Framework, but mainly its 3 key concepts. I like to refer to these as leadership, partnership, and planning. I'm going to go into some detail talking about why pre-disaster recovery planning is so important and provide you with some tools and some guidance on what you can do to support the state and the local governments in terms of pre-disaster recovery planning. And then I'm going to turn it over to Kevin Snyder, who's our Federal Disaster Recovery Coordinator, and he's going to be providing you with some examples of some of the ongoing efforts that we have in the field here in this region and across the country. So why is recovery complex? Well, recovery is complex because communities are complex. They are made up of networks that incorporate a lot of different components. And when we're looking in a post-disaster environment, we're seeing disturbances to one or maybe even all of those different sectors. So recovery is a lot like, just working with communities in general. You have to make sure that impacts in one area can oftentimes have detrimental cascading effects in other areas, and you need to kind of coordinate all those different elements together. So because recovery is so complex, they put together this guidance for how we can establish greater coordination. Post-disaster, we don't always implement the National Disaster Recovery Framework. It really is going to be utilized when we have very complex situations or catastrophic events or a higher level of coordination is needed. Again, disasters present a lot of different challenges, and we're going to be working with partners across many different areas. So we have put the National Disaster Recovery Framework is that guide that's designed to put partners together in a unified and collaborative method. This framework provides guidance and training, recommendations for how you can accomplish that. It's also a common doctrine that goes in collaboration with the National Response Framework, which is where we focus our partnership and our coordination in the response phase of the disaster cycle. We also want to define what those roles and relationships look like ahead of time, and we want to have a structure in place. So we're not exchanging business cards after the disaster takes place. Again, it's called the national framework and not the federal framework because it's not designed to be just at the federal level. It's really designed to be across all levels of government. And it's very scalable and flexible in nature, which I'll be talking about a little bit in some more detail. So this is a graphic I really like to show about the recovery continuum because it really does put into perspective that recovery occurs across, there really is all aspects of a disaster is where we're coordinating. I like this sentence here that the NDRF, it doesn't incorporate just getting our communities back to that pre-disaster conditions. We really want to move beyond that. We want to encompass more than just restoration of what we already had, and think in terms of resiliency and sustainability moving forward. And as you can see from this recovery continuum here, that what we're doing, it goes across these different timelines. We're really starting that coordination before the disaster hits. Preparedness is ongoing. We have our short term, those days right after a disaster. Then we get into the intermediate, and we're looking in terms of long-term recovery. We really are looking the months to years. There's a lot of different components. It's a very complex process, and when we're talking about recovery and revitalization, really this is a long-term process, and there's a lot of moving parts to that. So the three key concepts and principles of the NDRF that I'm going to be talking about today, again, as I mentioned, I like to call them leadership, partnership, and planning. I'm going to talk a little bit about that leadership at every level of government. I'm going to provide a little bit of context to the recovery support function coordination structure. And also, I want you to think about what that could look like in your community. If you work with a community at the local level or with the county, maybe at a regional perspective, or even at the state level, what can that translate to look like for you? And finally, I'm going to talk about planning. And when we talk about planning, we're really talking about that preparedness and how we incorporate resiliency and mitigation to that planning process. So that first key concept is leadership. Now, Kevin Snyder is for Region 3. He is our Federal Disaster Recovery Coordinator, and he coordinates that the partnership with our different agencies at that federal level, and that FDRC position is led by FEMA. It's the only position that we have prescribed what it's supposed to look like, but we have a number of recommended positions. Depending on whether it's a tribe or territory or state, oftentimes we'll work in coordination with a state disaster recovery coordinator. For the sake of Virginia or Pennsylvania, that could be a Commonwealth disaster recovery coordinator. Then we also have a position for local disaster recovery manager. And the reason that position, we describe it as a manager instead of a coordinator, is because we understand that all recovery is local. And it all is managed at that local level. And at that local level, it's a manager working that position, because really they are coordinating that, they're managing that in their own community. So again, these are just recommended positions. We may find, germane to what a disaster looks like in your community, that you may have a position at a regional level. When Kevin speaks later, you'll get a better sense of what that FDRC is doing in the field post-disaster. I want to talk a little bit about the recovery support functions. So this is the structure that we embody for the National Disaster Recovery Framework in terms of how we provide recovery support. We look in terms of 6 components, and when I talk about these components on the next slide, they're going to seem very, very familiar to you, because these really are just components of everyday coordination in a community. The purpose of having these 6 structures is that we're looking to have these sectors focus on facilitating problem solving, identifying resources and promoting access, and then also fostering that communication and that coordination across different levels with the states, with the other federal agencies that we work with, and with non-governmental organizations. So I mentioned, when we think about recovery, we think in terms of these 6 buckets, or these 6 sectors. And each one of these 6 areas is coordinated by a different federal agency. Community planning and capacity building, that is coordinated by FEMA. And the reason that it's FEMA is because we're really known to be a coordinating agency. We often are tasked with bringing the right partners to the table. I am the Community Planning Capacity Building Coordinator for FEMA Region 3. Next one is economic recovery. That is led by the Department of Commerce, led by the Economic Development Administration. We have Health and Social Services, as led by Department of Health and Human Services. Housing is led by HUD, Housing and Urban Development. The Infrastructure Systems RSF is led by Army Corps of Engineers, and the Natural and Cultural Resources is by the Department of Interior. Again, these are the 6 overarching functions that we're looking at in terms of long-term recovery. But as I mentioned, this framework is designed to be both scalable and flexible, which means that depending on the kind of disaster and the scale of the disaster and the complexity of the disaster, we may not be looking at all of these sectors. We may be looking at an incident that really only impacted a housing sector or the economic sector of a community. And in some cases, states like to add a few to these, or in some states, they may decide that they want to break out natural and cultural resources into two separate elements. Again, this is how we approach this at the federal level, but we design these functions to be flexible in terms of what your community needs are, and what your community looks like, and what works best in your community. So I spoke about leadership and about those different positions we have in terms of the coordinators at the federal, the state, and the local level. Talked a little bit about those 6 sectors or buckets and what those agencies are that kind of lead that effort. I'm going to take most of the time now and talk about planning and why planning is so important. And I think that, you know, both pre-disaster and post-disaster planning, they really do, they overlap, and there's a lot of the same elements in them, but we've provided a number of resources that kind of break them down for you. And the reason that planning is so important is because you really want to have a well-orchestrated process. When we talk about pre-disaster planning, we really want to make sure that we're coordinating all the right partners at the table. We're identifying what roles and responsibilities they have, and we're working together so that we can expedite that recovery support in a unified process. With post-disaster recovery, we're really focusing more on what are the benchmarks for progress, how are we scoping what the needs are, and identifying how we're going to be providing support. And I'm going to talk about both of them a little bit more, and some of the guidance documents that FEMA has established to help provide support to states and locals to better implement those planning aspects. So why do you want to prepare a pre-disaster recovery plan? And there's a number of reasons. We only have a couple bullets here, but really there's just so many wonderful reasons for why you want to have a pre-disaster recovery plan. You don't want to avoid that ad hoc process. Oftentimes we've seen in the past that it isn't until after after disaster that communities and locals are scrambling to identify who needs to have a seat at the table. We want to make sure that we have a clearly defined process ahead of time. If we focus on pre-disaster planning, we can make sure that we're engaging the public, and we're improving our coordination with the public, and we're ensuring that we're getting feedback from the members of our community, and that we're really not just identifying what we think is important for recovery, but really what are the needs of the community members. It also helps to establish that clear leadership roles, both pre and post-disaster. During the response phase at the local level, maybe the response phase, the emergency management agencies take the lead for that. Maybe that response in your community is led by a fire chief or your police department, or maybe your emergency management department if you have one. But when it comes to recovery, that process could be led by your planning organization, or it could be your community development agency, or maybe your housing agency. By talking about that ahead of time and establishing those roles ahead of time, we know who needs to be at the table. So when we're moving from that response phase to that recovery phase, we have a really smooth transition. Also, by establishing a pre-disaster recovery plan, we're able to identify those needs and resources that we need ahead of time. I have seen in many, many communities that after disaster occurs, oftentimes community members miss the opportunity for resources because many grants and funding opportunities, they have time frames. And oftentimes people don't find out about those resources until after that time frame passes. So if we have that coordination ahead of time, then we know what resources we have to bring to bear, and we know how best to leverage them. Additionally, we can maximize those opportunities to incorporate resilience and sustainability and risk reduction into our process. By identifying what the needs are of community pre-disaster, we know how we can make sure that we're incorporating those aspects into it post-disaster. And again, we're also helping to improve that coordination, not just at the local level, but the coordination between the locals and the states and the federals, and across all levels of partnerships for recovery. So some of these really fantastic guidance that FEMA headquarters has issued in the past year are the Pre-Disaster Recovery Planning Guide for local governments and a guide for state governments. We're also in the process of developing a third framework, which will be targeted at tribal governments, which is in the works now and is set to be published in the next few months. Both of these guidance documents provide some really great materials to use with case studies, lessons learned, resources with links and tools. They have model ordinances from the American Planning Association in terms of recovery model ordinances, a number of checklists. They have guidance materials that really help to support locals and states with the process moving forward with pre-disaster recovery planning. What's really fundamentally different between these two guides is that the local government guide really focuses on identifying what the needs are at the local level, where the state guide provides that focus on how states can work together with their coordinating partners to support local governments. So I definitely recommend checking out these two guides. You can put pre-disaster recovery planning guide into any search engine, and it should be the top link that comes up. But really, these are fantastic guides that really provide communities and partners with the steps that they can take for developing a pre-disaster recovery plan. Here's a snapshot of the comprehensive guiding planning steps that we have in these guides. Again, there's a lot of planners on the line, so you know what works best in terms of how to set up a plan. You may not have these 6 planning steps. You may have structures that work for you. You may have your own process for planning that works. This is really just a guidance. So, you can either incorporate this in full or work with the way you've done things in the past, or maybe take certain aspects of this. But these guides lay out these 6 steps for the planning process, and that's in coordination with the planning process that we use in FEMA and at the federal level, starting with forming that team and identifying who has a role at the table, what are the agencies that you work with, and then making sure that you're engaging the whole community in that planning process. Understanding the situation really has a lot to do with understanding your pre-existing conditions, your other planning guidances and documents that you have, if you have a mitigation plan, a comprehensive plan, economic development strategies, really just a number of plans that you have in your community, and making sure that you're incorporating all of those and understanding what your threats and hazards are and what your risks look like. Also, moving to the next step, what are your goals and objectives for planning? What is unique to your community? What are the issues that you face that help identify what those goals and milestones are that you're going to want to see moving forward? Going to be moving forward with planning, with developing the plan, and analyzing, identifying what resources you have to bear and developing your courses of action. And then you're going to be writing the plan and reviewing the plan and identifying the best method that you have for disseminating that plan. We recommend step 6, which is exercising the plan. That may be, in some cases, just revisiting that plan and seeing what's changed, making sure that it aligns with the other plans that you have in your community, and making sure that you're maintaining the plans. Again, you don't need to have all these steps, but what we do want to make sure is that you're incorporating these bullets here, these overall concepts. So you want to make sure that however you decide to approach that planning process, it's inclusive. You're bringing in all the members of your community, the foundations, the universities, all the stakeholders that play a role in your community. As I mentioned, you want to be integrating that with other community plans that you have. This pre-disaster recovery plan doesn't need to be a standalone plan. It could be part of an existing plan you already have. It may just be a chapter or an annex in your comprehensive plan or in your hazard mitigation plan. Really, the goal is to make sure that it aligns with the other plans that you have in your community. I want to make sure that it's goal-oriented and, again, scalable, which is something that we really push. Scalable, flexible, and germane to your community. And you want it to be comprehensive and long-term in scope. And make sure that it's focused on sustainability and resiliency, because again, oftentimes after disaster is when you have those opportunities with funding streams coming in from different sources. This is when you have those opportunities to actually implement some of those projects that you've identified in your comprehensive plan. So by having that focus on resiliency and sustainability, you can more quickly and efficiently expedite that process. Just want to walk through some of the relationships with planning. So starting with this blue bubble here on the top left, again, you have a number of plans in your community already. You want to make sure that you're looking into those plans, and that whatever your pre-disaster recovery plan looks like, it's being informed by all those other plans. You can either incorporate them into one big document, or you can have it be standalone. That really is going to be dependent upon the resources that you have available and what your needs are and what works best for you. Once you have that pre-disaster recovery plan and you've identified who has a role at the table and what your resources are and what your issues are, that's really going to set that stage for post-disaster for the kind of recovery policies that you're going to move forward with. So going from that green box on the top right to the gray box, that's where the disaster may occur or the incident So all the planning you do ahead of time really sets the stage for what those recovery policies are going to look like. Your post-disaster recovery plan may be something that you've already identified in your pre-disaster recovery plan, or it may be something that you decide to do after the disaster, after you're impacted by a disaster and you're working with your partners. And this is where some priorities may change. And this is where other resources will present themselves. So again, this is really very fluid in nature, but you're going to be using, those other plans to kind of set the stage for and inform what that post-disaster recovery plan is going to look like. That post-disaster recovery plan, which may be a plan or just a framework or a guidance document, that's really going to determine the recovery projects that you're implementing and what that recovery is going to look like. And again, it's a cycle that's going to help you identify, any updates that you have to do moving forward with the other plans that you have. So, it's really, I think this graphic really helps to frame how it's very fluid, and it's a living document. And you really want to make sure that as priorities in your community change, and as partnerships change, and as resources change, you're incorporating all of that into the process. Another resource I want to talk about, in addition to those planning guidance documents that I mentioned, is the effective coordination for recovery resources for state, tribal, territorial, and local incidents. This is another guidance document that came out of headquarters that builds upon that recovery coordination principles of the National Disaster Recovery Framework. What's different about this particular document is that it's designed to be used post-disaster. So this can be used in coordination with a pre-disaster recovery plan that you may already have. And this will help guide your post-disaster recovery process. You can use it ahead of time. We're not saying that it can only be used post-disaster, but it's really designed to help provide you with how you can organize and structure your resources after a disaster occurs. The other thing that's really great and unique about this document is that you don't have to have a presidential disaster declaration or a traditional Stafford Act declaration to develop post-disaster recovery planning. If you have an incident in your community that maybe doesn't warrant the level of federal resources coming in terms of a Stafford Act declaration, you still can put together a post-disaster recovery plan and use this as a guidance document for that. So in terms of recovery planning, and we've been talking about identifying who your resources should be and who you want to have at the table and who has a role. Think in terms of some of these bullets here, and maybe there's a lot more. Maybe there's a lot more that we haven't identified here, but traditionally, these are a lot of the partners that you may work with already on a day-to-day peacetime, blue skies situation. These are partners that you have. They play a role in recovery, and it may not be something that they've done before in the past, but if an incident or a disaster were to impact your community, it's very likely that they're going to have a role in that post-disaster recovery phase as well. So you're looking through this list and you're seeing that these are people that you work with every day. These are some examples of the kind of partners that you would want to have at the table as you're moving forward with your planning process. So another guide another tool that we have that I want to talk about, and I really think this is one of the best resources we have. I strongly encourage you to check out this Community Recovery Management Toolkit. This here is a snapshot of the website. This is on FEMA's website. Again, you can either go to the link that's right here on the bottom, or you can just put FEMA Community Recovery Management Toolkit into your search engine. And this really is just a fantastic resource. It has a lot of information. All the guidance documents I've already talked about so far today can be found on this website. So what is this toolkit? Well, this toolkit, it is an online resource of over 200 varied resources and information. We have videos and training materials. We have information about how to staff a recovery process, about financing recovery. We have checklists and model ordinances. There's links and tools, case studies at both the local level, regional levels, and state levels, and just tons and tons of guidance materials. The toolkit is structured into 4 central parts. That first section focuses on organizing your recovery process, how you do that at the community level, how you get people engaged, how you bring in local champions, how you can organize and identify what stakeholders to bring. Then it moves to part 2, which focuses on planning. And this is really where we identify how what kind of data you want to have, how you want to structure that plan, how you want to integrate mitigation and sustainability aspects. We've got examples and case studies from all over the country. We've got great resources. Part 3 talks about managing. So we've organized our recovery and we're planning it, but managing is really critical because, again, we want to have a structure in place that's going to be sustainable and long-term. So how do you bring partners to the table? How do you fund and resource a local disaster recovery manager? How do we build partnerships? How do we leverage resources? And again, maybe some areas that are more specific or sector specific might be about managing grants and financing. This is also where we provide a list of a lot of different resources from different sectors that you can bring to bear. And finally, that last part to this is that NDRF topic specific. So we talked about the 6 recovery support functions, and this is where you're going to be able to find more information about each of those sectors and information about those federal agencies and those partnerships that they have. Additionally, even though it's not listed here, but another really great resource of the toolkit is that there's a lot of information about training materials, and we're constantly updating that. So really, it's a fantastic resource, and I strongly recommend that you check it out. So before I pass it over to Kevin, just want to do a little summary of some of the things that we talked about and some of the issues that you should take home with you and think about. So again, disaster is complex. Just like working in a community, any community is very complex. There's a lot of different people that are part of that process, and we want to make sure that they're all here. We want to make sure that we have the right people coordinating. Because again, as I mentioned, you don't want to be handing out business cards at the disaster. You want to know who has a role ahead of time. You want to be able to coordinate ahead of time. Also, to think about how does it support localities in your state? How is it viewed differently based on a regional perspective, on your community? What does it look like in your area that is unique and germane to your area? And again, how do you weigh those current development goals that you have with the disaster recovery needs? You're going to have to reallocate your priorities, or are you able to kind of leverage them together and incorporate them? Take some time to think about that. And finally, what is your role personally in building that consensus around the recovery priorities, both at the state level, at the local level, and at the regional level? And I'm going to now turn it over to Kevin Snyder, my colleague and Federal Disaster Recovery Coordinator, and he's going to talk a little bit about some of the examples of where we've seen the NDRF in action in the field. Kevin?
Great. Thanks, Michelle. Good afternoon, everyone. So Michelle just gave you a really good overview of some of the key elements with pre-disaster recovery plans and some of the tools that are out there to help you develop those plans and see those concepts come to fruition. But we all operate in resource-constrained environments, and we know it's tough to reach that ideal, to have that plan on the shelf that you exercise pretty regularly. So over the next few slides here, we're going to take some time to talk about some real-world examples of where different components of the guidance that Michelle covered have been implemented in states and localities that have a wide range of disaster experience. And this first one here goes back to the Louisiana floods of 2016. So they had 2 separate flood events, one in the April-March timeframe earlier in the year, and then later in August. And both were pretty catastrophic and covered just about the entire state. The only portion of the state that really was spared was the New Orleans metro area. The rest of the state received significant flooding and widespread damages across the parishes there, mostly in the area of housing. And so this is 2016, 11 years after Hurricane Katrina, and you would think that with not just Katrina, but then Rita, Hurricane Gustav, and Ike, and the multiple events that the state had experienced, that they would have some of these elements in place there to enhance their ability to lead a recovery effort. But when we arrived in 2016, they still didn't have a pre-disaster recovery plan on the shelf at the state level. And they had an executive order that one of the previous gubernatorial administrations had signed, and that gave some really broad framework through which state agencies could coordinate and provide them with some authority to provide support to recovery efforts, but it wasn't what you would consider a pre-disaster recovery plan. So one of the things, I was deployed to Louisiana for a couple months last year, and we had the chance to work on helping the state build up this, institutionalize a pre-disaster recovery planning organization, a pre-disaster recovery organization, and the associated documents. And what you see here with this organizational chart is a representation of what that looked like. And they may have made some tweaks to it since we put this one together, the slide together, but gives you the basic idea of how the governor's office, all the way down to parish and local governments, coordinate with one another. How that's in blue down to the sort of brownish color in the bottom within the bigger gray box. On the right-hand side, on the green, you'll see the federal structure, which Michelle eloquently described earlier. But then one of the things that gets to this sort of so what? Why should we be thinking about doing this? On the right-hand side, you see this list of sort of, I guess we call them non-traditional stakeholders with recovery efforts, but it's that partner engagement, those outside resources that can be brought to the table to help advance state and local recovery efforts. And you'll find those resources in many different places. The private sector can bring some experience. You'll have foundations and NGOs, both the local, regional, and national level, that want to engage after an event. And having this structure in place early on will allow the state to message out, here are our priorities, here are our needs, here are the issues, here's where we want to go in the future. And those outside partners can see that and say, all right, this is going to be a well-managed effort. We have an idea how we can plug in to support, how our resources can be leveraged, how we won't, that we will know that we won't be duplicating efforts or possibly like pulling away resources that could be used in another manner from the state and local level. So there's a lot of benefit there to having these structures in place ahead of time. And that's, really getting at one of the key parts of the pre-disaster recovery planning, avoiding that ad hoc process, the lost time. You remember that wave chart that Michelle showed earlier, the graphic with the 3 short-term, intermediate, and long-term waves, and how that long-term wave went all the way back to the very beginning, because we recognize that there are decisions that will be made days, weeks after a disaster event that are going to impact that long-term recovery. And the more you have in place ahead of time, the more you know about how people work with one another, the better off you're going to be in making sound decisions for that long-term recovery. And it goes to how we engage and interact with these outside resources on the right-hand side here. So from Louisiana, one example, before we get to the next slide, we'll stay on this slide for a second here, what had to do with the philanthropic community. So there are many community-based foundations in Louisiana. They don't have a long history of working well together. I mean, as you can imagine, they compete for a lot of the same resources during steady state. And so, but we saw an opportunity for them to maybe take things in a different direction and pull their resources together, to use that as a way to attract additional resources from the national level. This event, while it impacted the entire state, or almost the entire state, and led to hundreds of millions of dollars of damage, it didn't get a lot of media attention last year. And, with media attention comes attention from national foundations and donations. And so that component of the recovery effort was missing. But the state, through organizing in this way, with the support of the federal government that had some resources to help build the capacity, worked closely with the community-based foundations, as well as some state-level foundations, to help them pull their resources together. And they really broke new ground down there and coming to, they signed a memorandum of understanding about how they would work and you dedicate some of their individual funds to a joint pool of funds focused on certain priority areas, and then use that as a way to try and attract additional investment from outside of the state. So I think that's one example of a so what that can come from having some of these things in place. Could you go to the next slide, please, Michelle? Thanks. Another thing that we saw another effort that came out of the 2016 floods in Louisiana was, they call it Resilient Recovery Initiative, and resilience is really something that is just embedded in the way that we think with any recovery. So it's a little redundant, but the real idea here was we saw opportunities for FEMA to work better across our program areas. So to have the mitigation program area working more closely with the recovery effort. And we do work hard to have that happen, but what they saw here in Louisiana was a chance to, one, integrate those programs a little bit more, but also help the state think about conducting the recovery at a watershed level. So the governor realized, all right, we've been through a lot of similar events over the past 10 years. And, we keep kind of doing the same things, but maybe we need to look at how we spend the billions that are going to come into our state after these floods in a better way, a more sound way. And this idea of watershed-based regionalism rose to the top. And the governor's office committed to prioritizing some of the discretionary dollars that they had to projects and efforts that would advance this idea of regionalism. And FEMA, along with the Environmental Protection Agency, the United States Army Corps of Engineers, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Aeronautical Agency, and others pull together to support that effort with tools, with people, with geographic information system report, a wide range of support, went all the way down to the local level, including some local level planning support to help them implement this. And they were looking to achieve it over 3 distinct phases. One would be heavy federal support to kind of get things stood up and in place. That second phase, it would be kind of 50-50, maybe 60-40. And then by the third phase, the state was committed to taking this on as their own. And then, and really kind of pushing it forward as a way to not only advance the recovery from the 2016 floods, but to build resilience into the way that they spend those dollars so that they decrease the risk for a similar type event in the future. And that is an ongoing effort right now. They're still working toward, they're still within phase 1 in Louisiana and working to advance this concept. So we're excited to see how this moves forward and how we've been thinking of it sort of as a pilot, but how can we translate some of what was done in Louisiana to other states that we work with and kind of promote it as a part of pre-disaster recovery planning. All right, next slide, please. Another more local event from 2016 was in Ellicott City in Howard County, Maryland. So you're within the sphere of the Washington, D.C. metro area. Howard County is a relatively wealthy county in the big scheme of things. They have a good deal of capacity, and they had actually engaged in the beginning of writing a county level local disaster recovery plan. The state of, I'll make a plug for some other resources that are out there. You'll probably find a link to this through the FEMA website resource that Michelle mentioned earlier. But the Maryland Emergency Management Agency, they have published guidance for local governments in the state of Maryland on how they can write a pre-disaster recovery plan, the steps to go through, and they have some resources at the state level to help the locals along with that sort of process. And in Ellicott City, or more broadly Howard County, I'll speak to Howard County and Ellicott City kind of interchangeably. There aren't any incorporated areas within Howard County. Ellicott City is unincorporated, but it's a historic mill town, and so people just know it as a town itself. But it was Howard County government that was working on this pre-disaster recovery plan, and they had started to flesh out the beginnings of a framework, so an org chart similar to what you saw earlier. But most importantly, they were engaging with some of their key partners, sitting down with them on an individual basis. Hey, here's how we think we would want to organize ourselves after an event. Here, are the capabilities that we think we need to develop within the county. What sort of things can you do? What sort of resources can you bring to the table? And thinking through those components, and they had got all of the principal parties at the county level. So the various departments, the Department of Planning and Public Works, Transportation, et cetera, signed off on this, and they were on board and looking to move forward when this flood event happened in Ellicott City. And it was a really small scale event, but a torrential downpour. And I'm not a meteorologist, but it was a unique storm system that just kind of like sat over Ellicott City, moved a little bit, and then came back and fed upon itself. And just like I said, it's an old mill town, so it's built near the water, and the downtown district was just devastated. And so they quickly, got into gear. Obviously, they're initially focused on life-saving and life-sustaining activities, but this is really like an economic disaster for Ellicott City. And they realized, hey, we're going to have to kick into this pre-disaster recovery plan. We're going to have to, we're not going to get the chance to finish writing it, let alone exercise it. Now we're just going to implement it. And there were some challenges early on because, as you can imagine, at the local level, people wear multiple hats. So they're moving right from emergency response into recovery, and it's some of the same people there. But that did allow for a good transition and handoff, understanding what the issues were, and transferring some of the information that's gathered early on, and working. There's a familiar face at the county level for the local businesses and residents that were impacted. And what's really remarkable to me, and I think it speaks to some of the pre-disaster work that they were doing there, are what you see in that last bullet, the as of 7/19/2017. So these numbers are a couple months out of date, but this is remarkable to see that high percentage of displaced residents returned, but particularly like 93% of businesses returned, and 17 new businesses have opened. You just don't see those sorts of numbers typically, and it's not just all the pre-disaster recovery plan, but a strong business community in Ellicott City and a well-resourced county. But they did not lose any time thinking about getting how they're going to manage the recovery effort. They were able to jump right into it and start to work one-on-one with the local businesses there, find out what their needs were, how long were they going to stay, put them in touch with other state and county resources that were available to them, and to keep things moving forward. And for them to deliver this message, hey, we're not, Ellicott City is going to be what it once was again, and the local, state, federal resources are behind you. We're pulling on the same end of the rope here. And I think that gave a lot of confidence to the local businesses in Ellicott City. And part of that is due to the pre-disaster work that they were able to do to put some of these things into place. So we'll go to the next slide. So this is also from FEMA Region 3. So we're, as Michelle mentioned, we're out of the Philadelphia office, and we have the states of Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and the District of Columbia, so 6 in total. And all of our states are pretty, far along with pre-disaster recovery planning. I think in terms of, that sort of effort, we're further along than most other FEMA regions. That being said, West Virginia did not, and it did not have one in place. They are working on it right now, and that's the point of the story here. But another flood from 2016. So Michelle was in Philadelphia. I was in Louisiana at the time when these flash floods hit. 23 people died. It devastated 12 counties across the southern part of West Virginia. And so the disaster period was actually 5 days in late June. And so that's, it's not just a 1 or 2 day hurricane blowing through. That's a long period of heavy storms and broad-ranging impacts across 12 counties that were, these are counties in West Virginia that had built themselves on extraction-based industries, so either lumber or coal or other natural resources. And obviously with changes in the national economy, the demand for those resources is less, and so those economies were kind of in a period of transition, and they weren't really sure what was next for them. Additionally, the state of West Virginia, while they've experienced multiple flood events over the past 10 to 15 years. This was out of the ordinary for them. This was larger than anything they had seen in recent memory, and they didn't have a recovery plan in place. But what we were able to do early on is deploy my counterpart, so the Federal Disaster Recovery Coordinator from FEMA Region 1 to West Virginia, because I was still in Louisiana at the time. And he was on the ground during the disaster period, which is, unusual. And I say that only to point out that gave him access to some of the folks involved in the economic development sphere in West Virginia. So folks from the Department of Commerce and, believe it or not, the West Virginia National Guard, who does a lot of economic development work in West Virginia, and to talk to them early on to say, all right, while you don't have a pre-disaster recovery plan in place, here's what we know from experience. Here are some of the things that you can be doing right now to help position the state for a more expedient, more efficient recovery effort. And so from that, on July 13th, we saw, at the time it was Governor Tomblin, we have a new governor at this time, designated the West Virginia National Guard Adjutant General Hoyer is his name, as the chief recovery officer. And then the secretary for the Department of Commerce as the state disaster recovery officer. So we thought, fantastic, this is great. This is, what Michelle mentioned, the key principles, leadership being one of them. Here they are, they're adopting that principle, they're appointing leadership. But where we struggled was that the roles and responsibilities for those two positions weren't clearly defined. Their expectations weren't clearly set by the governor's office. There was no planning document for them to go back to and say, all right, here's what we do, here's who we work with, here are the groups that we're going to convene to start, thinking about what resources can be brought to this recovery effort. We were making that up as we moved forward. That's that ad hoc process that you're trying to avoid. And because of that, we lost some time early on. We probably missed some opportunities. As Michelle mentioned, there are grant opportunities that come along that if you're not well organized, you may miss. There are decisions that are made early on about housing reconstruction or rebuilding infrastructure that you may miss opportunities to enhance your resilience or to fit in with, broader regional plans that can push a region's economy forward. So we worked with them to kind of put some of those things in place, but like I said, some opportunities were probably missed and some time was lost. Next slide, please. So one of the strategies that we advocated in partnership with the state was that they establish state resilience office, some entity that can be focused on during steady state or during, that the times when you don't have a disaster. They're focused on ways to build the state's resilience. And this isn't just kind of a FEMA mitigation or let's elevate some houses kind of resilience. This is, looking at the economy. What can we do to make sure that there's a more resilient economy that's not single industry focused? It has to do with the infrastructure that they build there, and how does that link up with the economic development strategies that they have in place and on the books? And so this state resilience office would also, bring together partners. It's that collaboration of different departments and agencies that work together to solve problems focused on resilience. And one of the things that they should be focused on is writing a pre-disaster recovery plan. Let's organize ourselves steady state so that when the next disaster hits, we have an idea about how we're going to talk to one another, the resources that we can bring together, the timing of when we apply those resources, et cetera. And so at the top of this resilience office is a board, which brings together these 8 departments and divisions in West Virginia. And there are some, sorry about that. So there are maybe a couple that are missing here that the state is looking into adding. That you don't see a health department, the state level health department represented here. And then ag also, which is can be a big player in West Virginia, depending on what part of the state you're in. So, but this is a great first step. And so could you go to the next slide, please, Michelle? Thank you. So what did they do? How did they get this office set up? Well, the state actually passed legislation that institutionalized the State Resilience Office. And as far as I know, it's the only state to do this. The state of Colorado has the Colorado Recovery and Resilience Office, but it's within the governor's office. So with a new administration, you could theoretically see that office go a different direction or not exist anymore. They've had a lot of success, so I don't see them doing that, but you never know. Well, in West Virginia, it would take an act of legislation for this not to be around. So that's really a bold first move for. It was a new governor that came in and signed the legislation. So sort of work that started with the previous administration was made final with this new administration. And what it does is it authorizes the State Resilience Office. They're the recipient of any non-Stafford Act funding that comes into the state. So what's Stafford Act? It's basically the FEMA programs, the public assistance for infrastructure or hazard mitigation grant programs. And those stay where they are right now, but other funds, so a special allocation of community development block grant funds, will be managed by the State Resilience Office. And that empowers them to direct the expenditure of money that hopefully aligns with pre-disaster recovery policies and objectives and goals that they have worked on collaboratively with these 8 different state level departments and agencies. All right, next slide, please. A lot of text here, but just gives you the basic outline of what the task is doing based on the legislation. And we'll go next slide here. One of the ways that we're supporting the state with the standing up the State Resilience Office is helping them develop a resilience framework. So that'll be a guiding document for them. And they will also, it's yet to be fleshed out whether or not the framework will address some of the key elements of a pre-disaster recovery plan, or if that will be a separate document. But that is on their document, their docket or list of things to do, is to write a state level pre-disaster recovery plan. And they'll be able to do that with some of the CDBG funds that they received as a result of last summer's flooding in 2016. Next slide. All right, so here we are at the question and discussion period. I've left us about 7 minutes for that. So hopefully, you've had a chance to digest, some of the ideal, what we'd like to see in a pre-disaster recovery plan, what we know what works well, some of the tools that are available for you as you think about, what's my next step in writing one, and then also real world examples of how components of what we're talking about have benefited different communities and how they've adopted some of these concepts. So with that, I guess I will turn it back over to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Kevin and Michelle. I'll give people a few minutes to type in questions if you have any questions. As a reminder, this will be posted to our YouTube page in 24 hours. You can search it by just searching APA Virginia. If you just watched this, you are eligible for 1 CM credit, and you can find that code by searching it on planning.org, or we have that information on the webinar page at apavirginia.com. I have one question here from Milton Hurd. He asked, how has day-to-day work in your office changed under the new administration?
Michelle,
Kevin, do you want to? I'll go first. I mean, Kevin and I can both answer that since we do a little bit of a different workload. So the day-to-day work has not changed at all. We still work, we work closely in coordination with our states and, the efforts that they have ongoing. So, in the past couple of months, we've been taking, coordinating with the state of Pennsylvania and with Virginia as they're updating and developing their pre-disaster recovery plans, and we've been supporting them. We've continued to work with communities. Pennsylvania, Muncie, Pennsylvania, for example, is a community that's getting a lot of different funding from a lot of different sources, and they're looking on how they can leverage all those funds to brand themselves as the most resilient community in Pennsylvania. So we continue to work with them, for example. We continue to do trainings and, review policy and guidance, and a lot of the work has been the same on a day-to-day perspective. I think it's more likely to I guess be different in this administration under disaster time, but from my perspective, I haven't seen any changes in my day-to-day operation. And I'll let Kevin answer that from his perspective as well.
Yeah, I would agree with what Michelle has said. We haven't seen a lot of change, and in some ways we have the benefit of, with any new administration, you see changes at the top. With FEMA, there are requirements that the administrator, the top of the org chart, the administrator for FEMA, have a background expertise in emergency management. And that came out of the post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act. So after Katrina, Congress recognized that, hey, this agency is too important for it to get caught up in, the churn of political appointees. So we're going to place certain requirements on the people that run it. And so that means that we have professionals at the top, and we have folks that know how to run an emergency management agency. And even though we're stretched pretty thin nationally, the whole nation is, with the recent slew of disasters, I think you see some of that come to fruition. Does that mean there won't be some minor changes down the road, or something that this new administration wants to do that the previous didn't? No, it doesn't. You could see some of that, but overall, 90-95% of what we do, I don't see much of a change, and that's because we stay focused on helping survivors and their time of need through the response and into recovery effort.
Okay, thank you very much. I have another question from Matt Windling. He asked how both GIS and drone technology can be used for the pre-disaster plan. Noticed image taken of the West Virginia flood. Did FEMA use drones to take these images?
Michelle, I'll let you take a first crack at that one since you
Sure. I'll start with the drone perspective. Again, we're not really working with them with long-term recovery, but I'm not exactly sure where it stands, but I know that both our response staff and our external affairs staff are coordinating at a higher level for use of drones to do preliminary damage assessments, which is where, after a disaster hit and we're trying to identify, whether or not a state or certain counties reach the threshold to declare a Stafford Act, we do damage assessments, and there's a lot of conversation about drones being used to fly over those damaged, impacted areas to identify, to do flyover, which we've done traditionally in helicopters and planes before. They also are interested in using drones to kind of tell the story. External Affairs is looking at how that footage can be used to tell the story of the disaster. So again, this is all kind of in process now, looking to see how we can leverage with the other partners. Kevin may know a little bit more about that, that he can speak to. And GIS has definitely become a really big part of our coordination, but I'll let Kevin talk to those two from here.
Yeah, sure. So like Michelle said, we don't yet use drones a lot. I think there's potential there for us somewhere down the road, especially kind of do like some time-lapse progress. A lot of the sort of innovation with drones is happening, I think, at the state level. You could actually look at the state of Delaware. They've got some interesting things going on there. We recently had a meeting with them where we talked about the potential to use drones for recovery, but that's still very much in its infancy. And GIS just overall is a really important tool for us as we conduct our initial assessments and evaluations to determine issues and needs, and just throughout the process too. So we use it quite a bit.
Alrighty, those are the only questions I have. Thank you again. I just want to remind everyone to mark your calendars for next month's webinar on November 27th from noon to 1 p.m. And you can sign up for that on apavirginia.com. Thank you again, Kevin and Michelle, for presenting with us today. And thank you everyone for joining us for this Monday's webinar. Hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.